Hello, scientists. It's Mr. Gopal here, back with another lesson that relates to some of the recent things that we spoke about with respect to climate change. So whenever you're considering climate change, it's important to consider humanity's role in this. If we think about it, and I didn't discuss this in a previous video on climate change, but what we know about climate cycles or cycles in the raising and lowering of the temperature of the Earth overall over time suggests that there was a reliable cycle that you could chart out for many millions of years. And then when human beings came along, that cycle seems to have been disrupted. Okay, this brings me to the support that I set up and the focus question for today. So this is part of the human impact on the environment unit, our final unit for living environment. And the focus question here is, how can we investigate solutions to climate change and pollution that have been caused by human impact on the environment? And when we say investigate solutions, we're talking about understand the pros and cons of different approaches. Climate change is such a great, large phenomenon that there are so many different ways to positively impact it and try to reverse it. And we need to kind of vet all of those different ideas. Before we do that, I'm going to take you over to a resource that I made. And this resource is related to one of the sources that you look at in this. So if we go down here, there's the question, what's climate change mitigation? What's climate change adaptation? What's similar, what's different about these two responses to climate change? And also, why do you think we want to use a combination of mitigation and adaptation strategies for dealing with climate change? So there is this NASA excerpt that you're going to read. But in addition to that, I just wanted to get us in on the ground floor. So we discussed climate change before. And again, I'm going to refer back to the difference between weather and climate. When we talk about weather, we're talking about daily patterns in the state of the atmosphere. That's different all over the world, okay? On the other hand, when we talk about climate, we're talking about weather patterns over years, decades, centuries, and millennia, right? Climate change is the term used to denote the rise in the overall temperature of the planet. And this is a rise that's year on year, decade on decade, and so on and so forth. So if I ask you, what's the weather this Tuesday? What's it going to be? Then we're going to look at the weather report for that day. That's just a brief snapshot. It's not enough information for us to make any inferences about the overall change to the temperature of the planet. On the other hand, if I ask you, what's the climate been like in, let's say, New York over the past decade, we could even, with that little information, and trust me, that's a little bit if we're talking about the Earth being millions of years old, with that little information, still we can see dramatic changes that lead us to the conclusion that the overall temperature of the planet is rising. Okay, and we need to respond to that. There are so many adverse effects that I discussed in a previous video to this phenomenon. Okay, and so our approach, as NASA tells us, is two-pronged. And when we talk about mitigation of climate change, this is the thing that we're going to look at the most today, I would say. Mitigation is the act of reducing the severity of the impact of climate change on the planet and human life, all right? And so if we're trying to mitigate, that means that we're trying to turn to green energy or environmentally friendly and energy solutions. We're trying to reduce food waste. We're trying to find alternative sources of food so that we're not necessarily burning fossil fuels to process meat, okay? And so on and so forth. Adaptation, on the other hand, is changing the way that we live our daily lives in order to respond to a planet that is ravaged by climate change. So I'll give you the simplest example of adaptation I can think of. There are going to be increasing amounts of natural disasters, or I guess you could say an increasing frequency of natural disasters along the shorelines. That's because climate change causes the melting of the polar ice caps, which causes the rising of the sea levels. I discussed this in a previous video. And all of that means that our shores are under threat. There's going to be greater flooding. There's probably going to be greater hurricanes, greater amounts of hurricanes, a frequency of hurricanes. And so people who live on the shore 100 years ago didn't need to do what people who live on the shore now need to do in terms of adaptation. Okay, so I would suggest that in terms of adapting to living on the shore in the era of climate change problems coming to the fore, human beings need to build structures to prevent their houses being flooded, such as elevating them, such as building dikes or dams to kind of control the flow of water onto the shore, perhaps even move away from the shore. But at the very least, they need to protect their property and their belongings in a way that they didn't have to a century ago. And this is an example of adapting to a world in which climate change is a clear and present threat. So that's the difference between mitigation and adaptation. Now, the other part of this video is focused on helping you annotate the top 10 solutions to reverse climate change. So if we look over here, after you look through a series of resources, so we look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's news conference about the Green New Deal, which is a set or a portfolio of initiatives to address climate change and create jobs at the same time in New York. Okay, we have a background video from Vox explaining the Green New Deal. And then after you go through all of that, you're going to look at this top 10 solutions to reverse climate change from Green America. So if we look at this, the first thing that I notice is that the text is small and things start to get very complicated very quickly. For example, if we're looking at this section on refrigerant management, I can see that they're talking about complicated carbon compounds, okay, that are related to creating useful refrigerants, but they also have a deleterious or negative impact on the environment. And then after we go through the problem, they talk about solutions being that are in progress and then work that still remains to be done. You need to annotate all 10 solutions. If we go down to the bottom, we've got 10 different solutions, all right? And so as an example of how to approach this, I've annotated one for you, and I want to talk about how I did it. So we see that every section, again, as I said before, is broken into the problem, the solutions in progress, and the work to be done, and then any resources that they have, okay? And then finally, there's a section called impact. And so there we have a really nice economic analysis of whether or not this is a feasible solution that will save us money and also save the planet, okay? And so what I've done in my document is made an example annotation according to the table that you receive in your slides, all right? So here's the solution of wind turbines that are onshore, meaning we have wind-based energy, modern windmills, that is, we call them turbines, that are inland, okay? And so they have to capture wind, they turn it into mechanical energy by the act of turning, and that can be used to power homes, you know, and communities. And so I'm going to start with the annotation advice that I have, and then we can look at the example of how I did it. So I want you to always start with the impact. It's no good discussing solutions or further obstacles if you don't understand the positive impact of a policy, all right? Zone in on how this addresses climate change by hunting for the following vocabulary words. So when I talk about the impact, I'm not only talking about the economic impact that they discuss at the end, but also we need to understand fundamentally, how is this going to make the world greener and lower carbon emissions and thereby fight climate change? So I look over here. Usually we find these things at the beginning. Again, vocabulary words that I'm looking for: zero emissions, reduce or reduction, green energy, and low carbon footprint. And as I explained, all of the above indicate a small to zero contribution to climate change. So they'll be good for the environment. So if I look here, I can see that wind energy is zero emissions, all right? And then they talk about some of the obstacles. We're going to come back to that later on, all right? And we can see down here as well, in the solutions in progress, today, 314,000 wind turbines supply 3.7% of global electricity. It will soon be much more. Ongoing cost reductions will make wind energy the least expensive source of installed electricity capacity, perhaps within a decade. So I should have added this into the document as well, But wherever you see statistics, you want to try to make a note of that as well, because that'll be a good chance that either you're talking about reasons why this is a good solution or obstacles to solving the problem of climate change with this particular policy. Okay. Now we want to talk about political obstacles. Even if a policy is sound, there's going to be political opposition, or it's going to be politically complicated to implement it. So that's often found in the work to be done. The ways and means for the United States to be fossil fuel and energy independent are here. What's missing is political will and leadership. Energy portfolio standards can mandate a share of renewable generation, so grants, loans, and tax incentives can encourage construction of wind capacity. So as I explained here, very often progress is halted by the government because its money supports a powerful lobby, in this case, the fossil fuel industry, or it doesn't understand the importance of innovation, and these are often obstacles to change. So if we're looking through, we want to look for money, because that's usually how politics is involved, by the allocation of monetary resources. The IMF estimates that the fossil fuel industry received more than 5.3 trillion worldwide in direct and indirect subsidies in 2015. In comparison, the US wind energy industry has received 12.3 billion only in direct subsidies since 2000. Now, 12.3 billion is a lot, but it's nothing compared to 5.3 trillion. And of course, we're talking about over a 15-year period since this article was written, versus over 1 year. Fossil fuel industry received, close to 50 times as much funding. All right. So if we were add into what needs to be done, see that funding needs to be increased dramatically. And we have the fossil fuel versus wind power funding example. Notice that I'm summarizing, putting things into my own words. All right. Finally, you want to interrogate the solutions. And this is where we look at the final section. I'm trying to figure out if the solution is too costly, does it have other negative consequences, and are its improvements not impactful enough? If I ask myself those three questions, I'll get a good idea. So we have some really nice stats here. If we just increase onshore wind power from 3 to 4% to 21.6%, this is the reduction in CO2 by 2050. That is a lot. Here's a greater reduction if we increase even more than to 21.6%. Here is the cost, okay? And so that actually, in the scheme of things, when you think that 5.3 trillion was spent in 1 year on fossil fuels, that's actually not that much. And then finally, the net savings. This is the most important part. You got a net savings of $7.4 trillion over 3 decades. That is a lot of money. And if we look back at the problem again, we want to look for anybody being critical of it. We see that in the first paragraph as well. The weather's not the same everywhere. When the variable nature of wind means there are times when the turbines aren't turning, and critics argue that turbines are noisy, they're unpleasant to look at, and they can be deadly to bats and birds. All right, so we found these issues with wind power, but to be honest, if we're weighing the costs and benefits, it seems like looking at something ugly is probably worth it if it's going to save the planet. In addition, we can see later on that there are slower turning blades that will address the concerns over birds and bat deaths. And in addition, they can route the power where it's needed, meaning even if there are fluctuations in the amount of wind in a certain area, it can be mitigated by having more wind power turbines, which are cheap to build and zero emissions, all right, over the planet. So this is an example of how to annotate one single box. You have 9 more, but I hope that this was very helpful. This is such an important unit, I'll just say in closing. So I really wanted to help you. It's also a great opportunity to become a more mindful annotator of information and really understand the way in which politics and environmental science and human impact all interconnect. So it's a great unit, very useful to helping you study, but also very useful to helping you understand the world. I hope this was helpful to you, and I'll see you soon.